free GRE Prep Hour. I am very excited to have all of you here with us this evening. So we are going to get started in just a moment. Here is what's on the agenda for tonight. We're going to be talking about logic-based reading comprehension questions. We're going to be talking about understanding arguments, finding logical flaws, and answering the right question. So I know that logic-based reading comprehension is something that often gives people some trouble. So let me hear from you. Do any of you have trouble with the logic-based reading comprehension? Is this something that anyone has struggled with in the past? Feel free to type into the chat window, those of you who are here with us this evening. If you're watching at home from YouTube later, obviously you won't be able to, but you will be able to play along. We're going to be doing live questions here, and you are welcome to attend any future free GRE prep hours. We offer these every couple of weeks. So before we get started, just a quick little plug here. The problems that we're going to be doing in this session are from the Manhattan Prep 5-pound guide for the GRE. So if you are in the middle of your prep or you're just starting your prep for the GRE, this is the biggest book on the market containing all the questions you could possibly need to do well on this test. So, as we said, we're talking about logic-based reading comprehension. And before we talk about logic-based reading comprehension, I want to talk a little bit about the verbal section in general. So those of you who've taken at least one practice test or have been studying for a while, you know that the verbal section of the GRE is composed of what types of questions? What do we have in the verbal section of the GRE? Well, there are three main question types. There are reading comprehension questions. You'll get 10 of those per 20 question section. And then what are the other sections, or sorry, the other question types on GRE Verbal? Right, sentence equivalence and text completion. So sentence equivalence, you typically get 4 of those. Text completion, you typically get 6 of those. These are the ones that we call the vocab-based verbal questions. And then reading comprehension, well, reading comprehension is kind of a wide question type. There are lots of different types of reading comprehension questions, but we can categorize those, broadly speaking, into 2 groups. We're looking at regular reading comprehension and logic-based. So when I say regular, I mean those long passages that you get about science or history. They're typically 2 to 3 paragraphs long. Takes you a while to scroll through and read those. And those ones have 2, 3, maybe even 4 questions per passage, which is nice because if you've spent the time to read a big, long 4-paragraph article, you don't want to be asked just one question about it, right? So these ones, you have a lot to read up front, but then you're going to be asked several questions about it. So who knows what types of questions were typically asked on regular reading comprehension? Yeah, the main point, main idea. You'll also get some specific detail questions according to the passage, which of the following is true about turtles or whatever the passage was about. And then you might be asked to make inferences. There might be some other ones here and there, like what a word means in context or author's tone. Yeah, someone is saying, what would the author most likely agree with? That's kind of a subset of inferences. What would the author agree with? Because if we're being asked to read the author's mind, and forgive my bad typing there, if we're being asked to read the author's mind, that's not something that's explicitly stated, but it's something we're kind of putting the pieces of together ourselves. So that's standard reading comprehension, and I'm guessing that most of you, even if you've never seen the GRE before, you've done reading comprehension before. Every standardized test that I have ever seen includes some form of reading comprehension. So this, at least, it doesn't mean it's easy, but at least it's familiar, right? So what's different about the logic-based reading comprehension? That is a totally different style. Can anyone kind of summarize what makes the logic-based ones different? Well, the logic-based reading comprehension, you get fewer of them. That's kind of the good news. If you find these difficult, you don't have as many to do. They are shorter. So you get one little passage, and then you get one question that goes with it rather than several questions. So there's less to read, less to do. But the big difference, and the one that actually transforms how we approach them, is this idea. They make a claim. Unlike regular reading comprehension that's academic style scholarship, well, another way of saying that is they're usually, I mean, not always, there are some exceptions, but academic style scholarship is usually fact-based. But when we're making a claim, giving certain premises to lead to a conclusion, this is opinion-based. A lot of these, not all of them. So we're less interested in what the facts are. We're more interested in how the logical pieces fit together. And so I love people are talking in the chat about question types that are included on logic-based reading comp. We're going to go through a bunch of these, not necessarily all of them, but the most common question types that you'll get on the logic-based reading comp are, oops, strengthen, weaken, find assumptions or flaws, draw an inference, kind of similar to the other inference questions that we get on the longer passages, and then explain a discrepancy or seeming paradox. So that's what we're going to be looking at tonight, is how these question types work, what we should do for each one, and how we can make sense of this idea that it's not really about the content, not about the turtles, right? But it's about the claim that the author is making, or how the logical pieces fit together. So I actually really like these. I think they're fun. I hope you think they're fun too. But they are kind of harder. They give us more work to do because they leave more unsaid. So let's do this. I want us to just dive straight in. I'm going to give you one to do. Please don't type your answers in the chat window, but I'll give you about 2 minutes to look through this one. Think about what you would choose as an answer, and then we will discuss. All right, hopefully that was enough time to give this one a try. You typically want to give yourself under 2 minutes to do these. I know that this one wasn't too much to read. Some of the other ones are a bit longer, but that's kind of what you want to aim for. So a couple things that we want to address in this one. One is just, what is an assumption? The question asks us, the conclusion depends on which of the following assumptions. But you know what? Before we even get into what's an assumption, I think there's a really important thing that we need to discuss, which is, what is an argument? When we talk about the researcher's argument or the conclusion, how do we define? There are basically two necessary pieces of an argument. What are they? Two necessary pieces of any argument. Yeah, we need to have a claim and we need to have premises for that claim. Reasoning or premises. Why we believe that that claim is going to happen. So let me give you an example, a sort of typical GRE style argument. If I said, I own a company and my revenue went up this year. Therefore, once I look at the books, I'll see that my profit has gone up. So we have premises, we have reasoning, my revenue went up, and then we have the claim, my profit. And I'm even going to actually edit this. You'll often see something like this. Instead of saying has gone up, will go up. That language right there, if it says will, anything that takes place in the future, we know that this is definitely an opinion. Whereas this one was a fact. All right, well, I mean, you guys can probably see at a glance, this is not a good argument, right? There is something major that we are missing. It's like we think that this is a chain that directly connects, but there is a broken link in our chain. What do we need to know if we're drawing a conclusion about profit? Not just revenue, we also need to know about costs. So we could frame this a few ways. We could say that there's just missing information. What about costs? Or we could frame it this way. We could say, in this case, there is an assumption that the author is making, something that was unstated, but that we're kind of treating like it's a premise that we just haven't said, which is that the costs did not go up. Or at least didn't go up so much as to cancel out the revenue increase, you know. So this is when we look at arguments on the GRE, I want us to think about three elements. These two elements are the ones that you'll see. The claim, the opinion, is kind of the most important one. The reasoning for it, you'll also see in the argument itself, usually. But the assumption, this third element, is unstated, but is absolutely necessary to the argument. So here's what makes logic-based reading comp totally different from other reading comp, is that you really need to pay attention to what's not written as well as what is written. Yeah, that is the general idea. Find what the main point is, find the reasoning for it, ask yourself about what's missing. So, coming back to this argument, we want to figure out, okay, the researcher's conclusion depends upon which of the following assumptions. In other words, what is the thing that was not stated but that would have to be true for this conclusion to hold? So in order to find that, we need to find two things first. We need to figure out what the conclusion was. We need to figure out what the reasoning, the premises for that conclusion were that we were given, and then we need to figure out what's missing. And here, not much of a mystery. I hope you guys were easily able to determine that if we say researchers have thus concluded, that's our conclusion. Our conclusion, the color of the car influences driver's behavior. And why do we think that? Well, we're pretty much only given one piece of reasoning for that. Red cars get more speeding tickets. So here's what we want to do. My recommendation, I know this might sound kind of cheesy, but when we're trying to figure out what's missing, where is the broken link here, treat the author as an idiot. And that might have been easy to do in this argument. This sounds like a pretty dumb argument, right? But treat the author, or think of the author, rather, as an idiot. I'm sure that you guys can all imagine someone, maybe a coworker, maybe a boss, maybe a political figure. We are not going to get into who you might think is an idiot. I'm sure we all have people on both sides of any spectrum who we think don't make good arguments. So picture a certain person in your head as the author. Picture them saying this. And that will make you more inclined to push back and be skeptical. I think a lot of times with standard reading comp, we treat it like a textbook, and we're like, okay, I'm taking the information in, I'm just seeing what I'm given, and I'm trusting it. With logic-based reading comp, you do not want to be trusting. You want to push back and be like, really? Does that make sense? Is that, come on, author. Like, this doesn't really hold up. This is an illogical argument. And here's how I think we can kind of broadly define what makes arguments illogical. Where we're thinking of the author as an idiot. Illogical usually means that the premises and the conclusion are really talking about two different things. So our reasoning, our premise was talking about getting speeding tickets from the police, right? But then the conclusion is about people's behavior. I think implied people's behavior about speeding. Are those really the same thing? Is who gets tickets? This one's really about who gets tickets. This one's really about who speeds. Are those really the same thing? As we well know in real life, you know, not all laws, not all rules are applied equally. So we could say that what we are assuming here, we're assuming that everyone is equally likely to be ticketed if they speed. Or maybe another way of saying that is all speeders get ticketed at the same rate, something like that, and that the rate of speeding tickets directly corresponds to the rate of speeding. So this, it might have been easy for you to see that on this one, this was what was missing here. But I want you to have that level of skepticism, that level of pushback with any argument. So now when we look at the answer choices for this one, conclusion depends on which of the following assumptions. We're looking for the thing that has to be true for the argument to hold. So we'd ask ourselves, does it have to be true that drivers of black cars receive the second most speeding tickets? I mean, we're not even talking about that. That has nothing to do with it. We don't know anything about anything except red cars versus non-red cars. Some of the other ones that people got rid of. Tell me in the chat, what's another answer choice that you got rid of because it doesn't have to be true? All right, I'm saying C. Does it have to be true that police officers do not drive red cars? No, I mean, police officers might get speeding tickets too. We have no idea. This is not something that is a must. Someone said D, red cars do not receive any more parking tickets. That's outside the scope. This argument is only concerned with speeding tickets, so parking tickets are irrelevant. And then someone else said E, drivers of red cars who are ticketed for speeding are able to appeal. Again, outside the scope. We're just trying to make the link between speeding tickets and speeding. That behavior, that's all we're trying to do here. So this does not have to be true. And then we look at B. And we want to ask ourselves, okay, does this have to be true? So one way to determine on a find the assumption question if something has to be true is to use what we call the negation test. And the idea is if the opposite of the assumption destroys the argument, then that thing was necessary to the argument. That might be a little convoluted. Let me show you what I mean. Looking at B, if I take the opposite of that, red cars do not, okay, the opposite would be red cars do attract more attention from the police. Well, if that's true, if red cars attract more attention from police, then the connection between getting speeding tickets and driver behavior, now these are not connected, right? So the opposite of B ruined the whole argument. That must mean that the original version of B was necessary to our argument, so that was the right answer. All right, you guys did awesome on this one, so let's make it harder, shall we? Let's always make it more complicated. So let's see what happens with, here's a recommendation before you start reading. If you see that you have one of these short reading comp, it's probably an argument based, what you can do is actually read the question first before you read the whole passage. Sometimes it helps frame what you're looking for. And this question says, which of the following, if true, most seriously undermines the findings of the study described above? So undermines is another way of saying weakens. Yeah, so this is a weaken question. And I find that a lot of people approach weaken questions kind of the wrong way. Oops, did not mean to do that. Let's do this. I don't even want us to look at the argument yet. Let's block this out. I want to talk about this idea of weakening and strengthening. So when we're thinking about arguments, let's go back to the original example that we had about my revenue went up. Therefore, profit went up. We all agreed that this was not a logically valid argument. But what if I added another premise in here that says, and my costs went down? Now, this is a logically valid argument, right? So if we have a logically valid argument, it can't be weakened, right? There's no way to weaken this one because it's logically airtight. If revenue went up and costs went down, by definition, profit went up. And weakening never means like call the author a liar, right? Take as true any information that's presented, revenue went up and cost went down. So we couldn't possibly weaken that, and we don't need to strengthen that because, hey, it's logically valid and there are no assumptions. I'm terrible at typing tonight. So if we have logical validity, we wouldn't need to do any of these things. So the implication, therefore, is that anytime you have find the assumption, weaken or strengthen, it's implied that you actually don't have a logically valid argument. In fact, we could say it's implied that the argument must be flawed. So before we look at the answer choices on this one, I want you to deconstruct this argument and think about where the argument is flawed. In other words, what is it missing? One question that people ask me a lot is whether to take notes on reading comprehension in general. And my thought is that's up to you. You know yourself, you know how you process information. If it helps you to take notes, take them. If it doesn't help, don't take them because it is kind of time consuming. If it's not adding value, you might not be able to afford the time investment to take notes. But one thing I do recommend doing um, for reading comp in general, especially for these logic-based reading comp, is to jot down something about what the question's asking for. So what I would mean in this case is jot down something about why the argument is flawed or what it's missing. So we want to undermine the findings of the study described above. I'm not going to type it all out. I'm sure you guys all were easily able to pinpoint. Sponsors of the study claim that reducing nicotine intake does not improve one's health. This is our conclusion. And we're basing that conclusion on, well, the fact that these Norwegian smokers reduced their intake from cigarettes, blah, 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 did not achieve significant health benefits. And then we've got mortality rates, cardiovascular disease, etc. Now, that kind of seems like an airtight argument, right? You read something like this and you're like, that sounds good to me. There's a bunch of facts that, nobody got any benefits. So yeah, there's no benefit. But picture the author as an idiot, right? Picture someone you think is really dumb saying this to you and you're going to push back. Where are we secretly talking about two different things? Where are the premises and the conclusion really talking about different things? Did anyone catch it? Okay, so some people are saying like, well, what about this number? Got up to 50%. What about more than 50%? So we're going from this subset, these 50,000 people who went up to 50%, and then we're going from that to reducing in general. So this is one common logical flaw that you'll see. We're going from a specific or a small sample to a generic or a large sample. And then, yeah, I think other people are pointing out really good things here too. We're talking about does not improve one's health, but what we talked about was mortality rate and cardiovascular disease. Those are only two examples. So here, I think that this is another, so we've got 50% reduction versus more than 50%, or versus, all reduction. And then we've got mortality and cardiovascular versus all health. In each of these cases, we're going from a small definition, a small subgroup, to something larger. And then, yeah, people are pointing out, what about longitudinal? We're talking about there's this study, but what did they do? Did they just do it for a year? Did they do it for 10 years? What about lifetime? So that is not really specified here. And then there's something else we're talking about. I think that there's something else where we're talking about different people, maybe going from specific to general. We're going from smokers to nicotine intake. That might be going from small to large. Yeah, we basically need a lot more information here. So when we're thinking about the answer choices, to weaken, we don't really want to attack the conclusion itself. We want to attack the missing pieces. We want to say, oh, that thing that you didn't specify, that actually was relevant. And there's something that we were assuming was true that may not be true. So take a look at the answer choices. All right, let's take a look at these answer choices now. So something important that I want to point out about weaken and strengthen questions. When we are looking for an answer on a weaken question, the right answer on a weaken question will not necessarily disprove the conclusion. we're not looking to say, no, the author's totally wrong and it does improve your health. That's not the objective. We're not trying to disprove the conclusion. What we're trying to do is we're trying to disrupt the connection between premises and conclusion. Disrupt the connection between premises and conclusion. Does that distinction make sense? It's sort of like, I don't know, in our earlier example, my revenue went up, therefore my profit went up. You don't need to weaken that by saying, no, your profit did not go up. You would weaken that by saying, well, we don't know about the costs and maybe they were higher. The conclusion might still be true. It's just that the premises don't lead directly to the conclusion. That's the idea. So we're trying to disrupt how these premises fit in with our conclusion, if that makes sense. So tell me so it's, my point in all of this is that it's a little bit different from find the assumption, where we were looking for what had to be the case for the conclusion to hold. In this case, we're not looking for what would make the conclusion totally fall apart. We're looking for stuff that's like, that's irrelevant. That doesn't impact the connection between premises and conclusion. So somebody was telling me in the chat, one thing that doesn't disrupt that connection, C, started smoking at different ages, various nicotine intake. I mean, that's just saying like, all right, well, this group of 50,000 Norwegian smokers, they're a varied group, but that doesn't make us any less likely to believe that the conclusion follows from these premises, right? It doesn't give us any really disrupting information. Is there anything else that doesn't disrupt? What would you say has no impact on these study results and then the conclusion that we drew from them? Yeah, men and women who smoked pipes and cigars. All right, who cares? You know, if it told us something about pipes and cigars and their nicotine reduction and how that's different, maybe, but that doesn't, we don't know if that makes it more or less likely that the conclusion holds. Yeah. And this is where it gets really tough. If you narrowed it down to these three, I'm kind of with you, because these are all relevant. These were, in fact, all things that we kind of mentioned, or at least D, for example, quitting entirely. Well, we talked about, the study was about people who were up to 50%. What about everyone else? So the conclusion is, reducing nicotine intake does not improve your health. And oh yeah, I had a question in the chat. Yeah, C and E we eliminated because they're irrelevant. That it just doesn't have an impact on the connection between these study results and the conclusion that we drew from it. Yeah. Basically, we're going from these results saying this group of people who are up to 50%, who reduced smoking cigarettes, they didn't have better health impacts for mortality or cardiovascular disease. And then from that, we're concluding reducing your nicotine doesn't improve your health. Yeah, here's where it gets nitpicky. And this is sometimes with the GRE, you're like, well, could we split hairs about the definition of this word, reducing nicotine? Here's what I would say about D, quitting smoking entirely. You're like, well, is reducing only less than 100% or does that include 100%? Here's what I would say. D kind of attacks our conclusion without addressing the premises. By that I mean, if D were true The conclusion would kind of be untrue, but the study results would be irrelevant. And what we want to do is take that study as a given and weaken how we went from that to the conclusion. Does that make sense? So stuff that just kind of comes out of left field, speaks to the conclusion but doesn't speak to the premises, that's not going to be a right answer on a strengthen or weaken question. So this is actually out. Tricky, right? So what we want to find, what I want you guys to find is where do we have something that speaks to the premises and how they connect to the conclusion? Ooh, interesting. People in the chat are saying A. What about A connects it to the premises? Aha. So, if we're looking at study participants who reduced their smoking but didn't actually reduce their nicotine, they're using nicotine from patches, they're using nicotine in some other way, then the conclusion that we drew doesn't follow from the premises. That is the difference. So this is when I say you want to look for the places where we're secretly talking about different things. Reducing cigarettes and reducing nicotine might not be the same thing if we introduce this new piece of information, that they have nicotine patches, nicotine gum. Now you could say, okay, B, there's secondhand smoke in these restaurants. That could be relevant. The problem with B, and you guys are going to hate this, I promise you, it is so frustrating. It's the word many. That's a problem. We have to be so nitpicky about language. I did another free GRE prep hour that you guys can look up about thinking like a lawyer, how you want to split hairs on words like this. Many people could just be like 100 out of the 50,000. I mean, 100 people is a lot. Maybe even 1,000 people is a lot. But would it be enough in this group of 50,000 to undermine the conclusion? We just don't know what the word many means. If that word many had instead been most or the majority, as we have in A, then that would give us mathematical reason to doubt. You see what I'm saying? Oh, it's so I went from giving you a nice, easy warm-up to a crushingly hard second question. And this is, I think, what makes logic-based reading comp really difficult, is it's not about the content. It's not about how we sort of treat information in real life. We want to make sure that we're answering the right question, make sure that we have the right approach, and then be careful with language. Should we assume that when we see many, it's probably not, it's probably the correct answer or probably not? It depends on the context. There are plenty of times that you would see, this is a good point to bring up. So I'm going to quickly just give us a little white box to draw on here. What I will say, very broadly speaking, is pay attention to differences in degree. And it depends on the question type. If the passage said, many people love studying for the GRE, right? And then it was, you know, what can be inferred? And there was an answer choice that said, most people love studying for standardized tests? Well, that would actually be a problem. So a lot of times this many versus most stuff, it can go in the opposite direction. If the passage says many, but the answer choice says most, we can't conclude that because many is too vague. It's a word without a mathematical definition. But most, the word most has a mathematical definition. It means what? It means more than 50%. And so mathematical specificity can be really important. It will sometimes be the case that if for an argument you need to say all people behave this way, and there's an answer choice that says some people behave this way, that's not enough. Sometimes it's the case, though, that a passage kind of talked about what some people do, and an answer choice talks about what all people do. So I'm not going to tell you that it's more often one or the other. What I will say is pay attention to discrepancy between what the passage is saying, what the question is saying, or what the answer choices are saying, rather. Hopefully that answered your question. It leads us, actually, very perfectly into the next thing that we're going to be talking about, which is discrepancy questions. And oh yeah, someone else made a really great point in the chat. The word some means not none. In other words, at least one. So the word some actually has a mathematical definition. You might not think of it that way, but it means at least one. So in this question type, we're going to be talking about which of the following are true best resolves the paradox in the above passage. So paradox questions, when we're asked to resolve a paradox or resolve a discrepancy, what that really means is we're missing key information. Something, we're given not an argument. And so that's an important thing to know about these. There's usually no claim, just pieces of information that seem contradict. And we need to figure out, well, what's missing here? Where are we secretly talking about two different things? That's the major theme overall, talking about two different things. So that if we add that new information in, it won't be a paradox anymore. So given that, I'm just going to throw you in and have you do the whole thing, answer choices and all. So give it a try. All right, I want to bring it back, take the answer choices away again, bring us back to just this part and think about where we're missing key information, or in other words, where we're talking about two different things. Because with these paradox questions, we're given some facts that would make us think one thing is true and then, whoop, surprise, something else is true. but it's generally the case that we're talking about two different things. So we're given that there's this research that shows that receiving high quality outpatient care rather than being confined to an institution produces the best quality of life. And then we pass this law. So we're releasing the people who are in institutions, but oops, paradox, they're faring worse. Well, who can tell me where we're talking about two different things in the original information given versus the paradoxical situation? So I wouldn't worry about the differences between the years. Sort of like we passed a law at some point, then we checked in. What happens after that, I don't know. But like in 1983, when we're looking at this data, it seems to contradict. Our original information was telling us a comparison between two things: high quality outpatient care versus confined to an institution. And then what happened after we passed the law? We're releasing people from institutions, but what do we not have information about? This first bit of information, the high quality care, is that happening? So maybe this comparison between high quality care and institutions isn't relevant when we're comparing institutions versus no care or something like that. So that's what wasn't addressed. Someone else brought up the fact that it's sort of implied that this is all about America, mentally ill people in the United States, but is that first fact about Americans? I do think that that's a good point, that that's relevant. You should always look at who is your sample set. But I think the paradox, what really feels like a paradox, is the care versus institution, and then we haven't addressed the care part. So looking at these answer choices now, if we want to resolve that paradox, probably want to address something about care. Yeah, so released from institutions, I love that, the way that Matt put it. Just because you're released from an institution doesn't necessarily mean you're providing high quality care. And so since we're short on time, we'll just cut to the chase. D was the one that addressed that. If we didn't provide the funding necessary to provide high quality care, then that comparison that we were looking at in the first bit of given information wasn't relevant. Releasing from an institution doesn't guarantee that you're going to have better outcomes. So someone was asking, like, what about E? Because it seems to give us more information about 1983. The problem with E, one of three mental illnesses, it's getting awfully specific. And that's one of those, it's like, well, I guess that's nice to know. It's more information. But what we want to do is like, this felt like it didn't connect with this. We need the piece of information that makes them connect. And I don't think that E, even though it's a nice to know, it doesn't give us any more reason, or basically our original fact is still surprising now. There still seems to be a disconnect. E doesn't resolve that disconnect. So it's all about what information is not there rather than what information is there. So I would say if we're doing big takeaways, I'm just going to click through a bunch of things that we didn't get to. Oops, going back here for a second. Takeaways about logic-based reading comprehension. It's often, maybe not always, but it's often all about what's not there in the passage rather than what is there. So if you're the kind of person who obsessively takes notes in great detail about every fact that was given, maybe that'll help you on the regular reading comp, but it's not really going to help you on the logic-based stuff where you're trying to figure out what's missing. The missing piece is often relevant to where the premises and conclusion we're talking about two different things, even though they seem to be talking about the same thing. Someone else asked a great question in the chat earlier. Are these similar to critical reasoning on the GMAT? I know some of you are probably studying in order to go to business school. If you're looking to do an MBA and trying to decide, should I do the GMAT, should I do the GRE? Maybe some of you have already studied for the GMAT. This will be pretty much exactly like critical reasoning, which is nice. No major differences there. For those of you who've never studied for the GMAT, don't even worry about it. I would say another takeaway though, logic-based reading comp, it's only 1 or 2 questions out of each 20 question section. If you're feeling really stuck on these, I would work on regular reading comp first because you're going to get 8 or 9 of those instead. That's probably more worth your time first. Then when you feel like you're doing pretty well with those, you can attack the logic-based ones and try to improve on those. The other thing I would say for reading comp in general, one big takeaway is what I like to call think like a lawyer. And by that I mean specific language matters. Get nitpicky about language. Yeah, someone else had a great takeaway in there. For these logic-based ones, read the question before reading the passage because it can help you frame what you're looking for. All right. If you want more practice, well, there are a lot of things you can do. Come to a class for free. Any Manhattan Prep class, online or in person, you get to come to the first session. We've got an 8-session course. You get to come to the first class totally for free and try it out. Even if you have no intention of signing up, you'll get a lot of great insight for free. We also have GRE Interact. It is a video series, fully interactive, and your first 7 days are free. I highly recommend that you check that out. It's really cool. It's adaptive learning. When you get something right, it learns that and remembers that and gives you different problems depending on that. I also would love to see you guys in the next free GRE prep hour that we do. We have these about every 2 weeks, so you can check our website for the schedule there. And then we also post these all on YouTube after the fact, so you can go back and watch previous ones. Like I said, I did one recently on think like a lawyer in reading comp, so I recommend that you check that out as well. Thank you guys so much. I wish you the very best of luck with your GRE studies, and take care.